Good evening. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk to you. And I also really appreciate the fact that I see a lot of friends here and no enemies that I'm aware of. The most challenging discussions are always with your friends, and I look forward to that in the discussion. Really particularly intimidating for me, I don't think I've ever given a talk before with my son in the front row, but we'll see how I get on. I have been asked to take on the very challenging agenda of following Thomas Piketty, who continues, I gather from some Dutch colleagues who had him had his roadshow in Amsterdam last week, that the frenzy around his appearances on Earth continue, and it's a repetition of what we saw here in the very well attended talk that TASC sponsored. I can't do the French accent, but more than that, I want to concentrate on a rather narrower topic, although I think it's a centrally important one. And I agree with everything that Brunchian said in the introduction, and he saved me saying some of those things, because wealth is centrally important. Income inequality, public services are centrally important. How we design our broader welfare state is absolutely fundamental. And summarizing income inequality and the distribution of income in one number has its perils, but having said all of that, that's what I'm going to go on and do for much of what I'm going to talk to you about. Because I want to talk about what's happened to income inequality over the past 30 years. Again, I apologize for the lack of ambition. Piketty goes back 100 years or more. In the case of France, it goes back 200 to the revolution. My modest aim is to try and say, what do we know about what's actually happened to income inequality over the 30 years up to the crisis, and indeed through the crisis. Paula said to me as we were chatting beforehand, just tell us what the blazes has been happening. So I want to try and capture that with all the qualifications that I'm afraid I'm going to have to enter in terms of how much weight we can place on the evidence we have, because it's wobbly, although it's much better than it used to be. And I'm tempted to fall back on metaphors about the foggy day and the fog that we try and understand what's been happening to our societies over this period because of the limitations in the database, but also in our understanding of the processes more fundamentally. But I want to try and talk about what do we think has actually been happening. Why should we be thinking of doing something about it? And lastly, what can we do? Because I suppose much of the rhetoric or debate or discussion that you hear about increasing inequality more broadly, but increasing income inequality in particular, goes along the following lines: that there's a wave of change brought on by, in particular, the speed and nature of technological change, destroying jobs in our societies. Talk a little bit about the impact outside the rich countries at the end, but destroying jobs and in a globalized economy, driving increasing inequality in income in the first instance, quite possibly in wealth in due course, although I'll say a little bit about that at the end, that this is just a wave that's crashing over the OECD countries, which I'll use as a sort of a catch, as a term to mean the rich countries, effectively. That this wave it's a matter of when it hits which country, that we can't really resist it, or at least that we can try for a while, but that in due course we just have to accept that inequality has to increase, and these are inexorable forces that we have to learn to somehow live with. Another part of this narrative is that this wave of increasing inequality inevitably will carry with it a whole range of negative social and political outcomes. And that it will reduce intergenerational mobility and produce more inequality in opportunity. And indeed lead to the sort of much more patriarchal society, or much more wealth-based society, where what's going to determine where you end up in the social scale, if you like, is even more than it is now, where you started off in terms of your parental household and the wealth in particular of that household. So the sort of Piketty story, if you like. And that worse than that, if you like, this represents a sort of a really fundamental and existential threat to the functioning of democratic political systems in the way that we would want them to function. And as if this wasn't bad, I'm reminded when we were told to turn off our mobiles, I was in the middle of something along these lines a couple of weeks ago when a mobile phone went off with a very jazzy piece of jazz music, totally interrupting the mood. And so let's hope we get some lightening of the mood at some point in this discussion, because the final nail in the coffin, if you like, in terms of this narrative, is that increasing income inequality and wealth inequality that goes with it is actually not only producing a whole range of social and political bads, but it's actually undermining the capacity of our economies to produce growth and prosperity. So I want to try and talk about these potential linkages, what the evidence is about whether we actually see this happening so far, which I would emphasize, to the extent that we don't, it doesn't mean that we won't in the future, but what is the evidence about just how much of this grand narrative stands up to an examination of the evidence. And then to spend some significant time at the end thinking in terms of why we should be doing something about income inequality, given all that, given the evidence as I understand it, and what we can do. So I'm now going to skate very quickly through a whole bunch of slides that you can read faster than I can talk, some of which will show you some patterns, some of which have words that I'll be asking you to read, and I'm just going to bounce off them in order to get across my understanding of the evidence and get to, if you like, where we need to get in terms of why we should be doing something and how. So I'm talking about, again, narrowly, the distribution of income, cash income, disposable income after taxes, after direct taxes, and after cash transfers and social welfare, fundamental to living standards, but not by any means on its own a good measure of living standards, but fundamental to your capacity to not just consume, but to build up wealth, not including the benefits from public expenditure on health and education and so on. I'm not going to dwell on these measurement issues except where I think it really matters. And what really matters is that most of what we know about the income distribution comes from household surveys. But what we know about the top of the income distribution, which, as Francine said, is what one hears a great deal about now, comes from a different source and is not easily aligned with what we know about the overall distribution from surveys. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to show you the pictures of the trends in terms of what has happened to the single most widely used measure of income inequality, which is the Gini coefficient, which goes from 0 to 1, higher is more unequal, and the range that you tend to see is sort of 0.2 to 0.4 in the rich countries. So what has happened? This is the way the OECD would summarize what has happened in terms of data they've collected over a 30-year period, up to the start of the crisis. So the higher line is the country that has the most, certainly among the most dramatic patterns, and tends to dominate the discussion because a lot of the research is there and a lot of the most dramatic findings and are there, and you can argue, it's to be argued, that they're in the front in the front line, and what happens there is what's coming for us down the line. So you can see in the top line that there's been a marked increase in income inequality measured this way in the USA over a long time. This is about as far back as the data reliably go, and inequality has been increasing since the late 1970s. Now, the lower line is a simple average of the Gini coefficients for the OECD countries, the 30 or so member states of the OECD, just averaged with not giving more importance to the bigger countries or anything like that. And you can see that it has also been going up, although rather more in the early part of the period we're looking at than towards the latter part, but significantly higher at the end than at the start. What I did with a very large number of colleagues in a project funded by the European Commission was try and get behind these numbers to look at what was happening year by year and country by country over these 30 years. And I'm going to flash up these graphs which show what happened to the Gini coefficient in collections of countries that are grouped together, roughly speaking, in terms of the nature of their welfare state. So these are the more liberal model English-speaking welfare states, and you can see that in most of those, there has indeed been a marked increase in income inequality over the whole period. Nicely there in green is ourselves, and you can see that the pattern for Ireland is rather different, that there's been some up and down, but over the period going back to the late 80s, which is about as far as we can reliably go back, the inequality isn't higher now than it was then. Very crudely, we can get into that in the discussion. So is that the common pattern? Is that simply pretty much what's been happening everywhere? Well, it might come as a bit of a surprise, and it did to me, although I suppose it shouldn't have, that even sharper increases in income inequality have been seen in the traditionally low inequality Nordic countries. So you've seen very sharp increases in income inequality in countries like Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. From a low base, it must be said, and it would in a sense be more helpful if it didn't muddle things to put them on the same graph, because these are much lower levels of inequality, but actually larger increases in some instances. What about countries like France, Germany, Belgium? Well, a mixed picture here. Some countries, including France, haven't seen much increase, whereas Germany, particularly recently, has seen quite marked increases in inequality. So a more mixed picture. What about countries that get grouped together because they have nice weather and they're near the Mediterranean? Well, again, a very mixed picture. In some of these, actually, if you can go back far enough, you see that inequality is lower now than it was at the start of the period, because they were, some of them, coming out of rather different political and economic models and transforming themselves into something like much more like the northwestern European countries. So a mixed picture there. Just to give you something to bite into, this is what happened in some of the countries that transitioned from state socialism in the early 90s. And the single most striking one is Estonia, which saw the most dramatic increase in the Gini coefficient that I think has been registered in a remarkably short space of time on transition, but then saw inequality subsequently decline. Whereas some of the other countries saw a slower increase, but a continued increase or a different pattern. And some of the countries that joined the European Union, having made that transition, actually didn't see very much increase in income inequality at all. And strikingly, some of those countries, such as the Czech Republic, are now the lowest inequality countries in the European Union, lower than the traditional winners of that competition, the Nordics. Now, that's all been about the overall distribution of income as we think we understand it across the whole distribution. What's been happening at the top, which is where we have had so much of the focus and so much of the public attention. I suppose it's worth emphasizing. I mean, Francis was saying about how important data is. If people like Tony Atkinson and Thomas Piketty had not invested the grunt work into, first of all, realizing that you could produce estimates of the top income shares from tax data, simply hadn't been realized and exploited up to 10 years ago or 8 years ago. if they hadn't realized that and invested the not very glamorous work in the archives in some instances, digging out these numbers and producing these estimates, and I did the ones for Ireland. It wasn't in a dusty archive, it was in my office in the SRI. But that work has fundamentally transformed, I think, the common understanding of what's been happening over the last 30 years. Because you wouldn't have seen it to anything like the same extent in the survey data that I've just been showing you. So unlike surveys, this approach is able to hone in on what's happening right at the top to people who, apart from anything else, have more things to be doing than answering surveys. So if you look at these top income share data, you'll see that this is only a subset of the countries that you could include from a very nice database called the World Top Income Database, that's generally accessible. That if you look here, you see that for countries like the UK, the USA, and Ireland, you saw a very marked increase in the share of total income, and we're still talking about income, we're not talking about wealth, we're talking about what you get into your pocket every year. You see a very sharp increase over quite a long period, going back to, let's say, 1980. Importantly, this is before tax, because that's the basis on which these estimates have been produced. Very quickly, as well as hearing a lot about the top, we hear a lot now about the squeezed middle. Is greater inequality squeezing the middle? Is a very hotly debated topic. And there's various ways of defining the middle and trying to capture that. This looks at people who are between, the median is the middle of the income distribution. This looks at people who are between 75% and 150% of that middle. And you can see that in some countries, increasing inequality has gone with some shrinkage in the middle, including very strikingly in Sweden, rather more than in the UK or the USA. But I think myself that this squeezed middle is not well understood in terms of what I think the middle is often squeezed, but not in terms of the size of the group or indeed its income, but in terms of what it can do with its income and the other demands on those incomes. So what's happening? What's happening to the distribution? Why in so many countries, and certainly at least 2/3 of the countries that I'm talking about, why have we seen increasing inequality? Well, it's very much to do with what's happening in the market. It's very much to do with the distribution of income from work. Which, apart from anything else, constitutes about 3/4 of total household income. So you can't get away from the fact that what's happening in the world of work is fundamental to the increases in inequality that we do see. That is certainly related to, but not, I think, to anything like, it's related to technology and technological change, but it's not about the robots taking our jobs, which is the other thing that one hears so much about now. It's certainly not simply about that, because this increase in inequality has been registered over a longer period, and in countries which haven't experienced the sort of hollowing out of the occupational structure that this notion of the robots are taking our jobs story would suggest. So it's about technology in a globalizing economy, but it's also about institutions. And it's also about policies. It's about other things as well. It's about incomes going to capital rather than labour, which in many countries we've seen a shift away from labour and towards capital. That has a relatively modest impact on the overall distribution, but it has a significant impact towards the top. And there's some other factors to do with the way household structures and age structures are changing that are also making a contribution, but not by any means a very substantial part of the story. Redistribution matters. The extent to which different countries have altered their direct redistributive mechanisms in terms of direct taxes and cash transfers, that makes a measurable difference to what you see and helps to explain some of the differences across countries that I've tried to emphasize that we see when we look at the evidence. Well, I'll say a little bit more about that. Some of this helps to understand what's happening at the top, but there's a great deal more happening at the top as well. In-depth analysis of what lies behind trends in top income shares, in the US in particular, where the data is better to some extent in the UK, shows that it's about three things. The three most important things are the way top executives get paid, the importance of the financial sector and the way the financial sector rewards itself, and I say that advisedly, and the increasing importance of income from capital rather than labour. Those three factors are fundamental at the top. And you can debate whether changes in the way top executives are paid and that filters down, and you've all seen the statistics about the ratio of top pay to average pay going from figures like 12, 14, 15 up to 120 was the latest number. So top pay is 120 times the ordinary workers' pay in the US. The role that changes in expectations, in norms, in social acceptability of those sorts of gaps, the role that plays, that's pretty much debated. Very quickly, I'm just going to summarize what we think we know about what happened to income inequality in the crisis. Because you might assume, and many of us did, that the crisis would kick on the trend towards greater inequality where it has been evident, and would start it where it hasn't. And the picture is rather more complicated, and I'm just going to summarize it there. This is the change in this single summary measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, in the countries of the European Union over the period from the start of the crisis. And all I'm going to say is there are nearly as many countries where inequality went down as ones where it went up. The crisis, the depth, the very striking, the worst crisis since the Great Depression and so on, the impact that has been very varied from country to country, partly because countries have had different crises in macroeconomic terms, in terms of the impact on growth, on employment and unemployment and so on, partly because the automatic stabilizers now built into our tax and social protection systems, thankfully, make the impact of the recession fundamentally different to what it was back in the 1930s. So simply would say, and in Ireland, for example, the crisis has had, inequality initially went down and then came back up again. Apart from anything else, a crisis of this depth and nature hits profits in the first instance and those towards the top. And you can see that in the top income shares. If you were looking very carefully, you would have seen that in the top income shares for Ireland, for the UK, and for the USA in the graphic I put up earlier. So the crisis has a variety of impacts on different forms of income going to different parts of the distribution, and we see strikingly different patterns for different countries. So what I would emphasize coming out of this part of what I want to say is rather than that straw man, I suppose, that I put up at the start about this wave of inequality sweeping over countries and looking rather similar in different countries, what's equally striking, I think, as well as the broadly shared trend towards inequality being higher now than it was 30 years ago, is the variation across countries. The variation in terms of some countries not yet seeing much increase in inequality, in terms of the patterning of inequality, in terms of when it happened, because while it's been a rather slow and steady increase in some countries, in others it's been very concentrated in very specific periods. In the UK, guess when, in Thatcher's Britain, with the increase in inequality in the UK since 1990 being really quite modest. In the USA, more concentrated in the early part of the period than the latter. In Canada, concentrated in a very narrow window. And in the Scandinavian countries, while there's been an increase over a longer period, some identifiable jumps in inequality, some of which you can attribute to rather specific policy changes. So it's not one single phenomenon that maybe is affecting different countries at different points in time, but hits them all the same way and has the same impact. And what matters is the context, the institutional structure in which this wave of change hits, if we think that technology and globalization represent such a wave. So what was the pre-existing institutional structure, particularly in the labour market? What was the tax and transfer redistributive mechanism, and how did policy respond? Because, as I say, you can point to very specific policy responses. For example, in Sweden, as it says up there, the redistributive effort through taxes and transfers fell away markedly over this period, associated with a rather different philosophy from the conservative government that was in power for most of the period. So you saw a reduction in inequality that made a significant contribution to what we saw as increasing, a reduction in redistribution that contributed to increasing inequality markedly. In other countries, you can point to things to do not with the redistributive system, but with the institutional structure and the elements of it. So, for example, in Germany, the very sharp increase in inequality is concentrated in the period after the Hartz reforms that changed the way the labour market worked and designedly produced a lot more low-paid jobs. In the UK, under Thatcher's government, fundamental changes in labour market structures and practices, as well as in the tax and welfare system. So we see a great deal of differentiation across countries in these respects, but I think it's also to be emphasised that we see a great deal of difference in terms of, while inequality was changing in the way that I've tried to capture here, what was happening to real incomes? What was happening to living standards to the limited extent that they're captured by incomes adjusted for changes in prices? So just to try and give one indication of this, what this shows is what happened to the real incomes of those in the middle of the income distribution. So we're not talking about people at the top, we're not talking about the lower part of the distribution, we're talking about a broadly defined middle. What happened to real incomes over the period up to the crisis, what happened in the crisis, and then what's the overall? So that's what these three bars show for each country. So what you can see is, strikingly on the far right, I think that the most interesting number here, in terms of where this debate has come from and where it's going, is the very limited increase in real incomes for the broad swathe of the middle of the income distribution in the USA over the period from here 1985, but actually you can go back further and the same story applies. So a modest, at best, improvement in real living standards for the bulk of the income distribution. And it's important that this was driven not by what was happening to any individual's wages, because the wages of the average worker or the median worker in the US have seen little or no improvement in real terms over a 30-year period. So the only reason that household incomes rose was that more people were in work. In particular, women's labour force participation went up. So when we talk about, so the context is absolutely critical here. Whereas strikingly, if you look next to it at the UK, despite the fact that inequality was increasing over much of this period, the broad bulk of the distribution saw very substantial increases in their purchasing power, in their real incomes. And unfortunately, where I got these numbers from, the OECD database doesn't have Ireland in the early part of the period, so I can't show what happened here, but you would of course see a very, very rapid increase in real incomes and in purchasing power over this period, before the very different sharp decline that we've seen in the crisis. Just one other number to note: if you look at Greece registered very substantial improvements in living standards over the period up to the crisis, all of which has been reversed in the crisis, according to these numbers. So that again is a very striking context, and maybe not for tonight, but to be noted. But the fact that increasing inequality in the USA over this long period has gone together with stagnating living standards is fundamental to the debate there and the wash of that debate to countries where that's not true, or at least hasn't been true until recently. It is true in the 5 years up to the crisis in the UK, and that's a central element in the work that I'm now taking on. That there, as in the USA for quite a long time, the key focus is on the interaction between inequality and living standards. So I think up to the crisis, and in our particular setting where we were seeing very sharp improvements in living standards, we tended to leave that out of the picture and take it for granted. But countries that haven't had that experience haven't had that luxury either. So I think I've said that. I want to talk now about why would we want to do something about this? Why would we regard this as problematic? So got a list here of reasons why you might want to worry and do something about it. And I'll come to what the something might be, the range of somethings, in a moment. So you might simply care about inequality in income and in wealth. This is a crude way of capturing overall inequality, but you might care about inequality, and you might think that income inequality is an important aspect of that. Now, I'm going to say something about the other reasons, and I'm actually not going to dwell on the normative, as it gets called, considerations that might underpin a concern with inequality in and of itself. There's some joke about economists talking about morals that I can't quite remember, but it goes something like, it's like a donkey talking about horse racing. That he has some general idea of what it's about, but absolutely can't do it. So I feel no basis for talking about with any expertise the normative reasons why we might want to worry about inequality in and of itself. But they're fundamental. And I think, and the point I want to make in raising this is, I think that there is a very real danger that we miss them, that we now miss them in the discourse. Not here tonight, but I think in the broader discourse about inequality, because I want to try and characterize the way I see that. So the reasons for worrying about inequality that we tend to hear about are this other list, and I want to whiz through them rather rapidly. So one very obvious reason that you might want to worry about inequality is if you thought that what you cared about fundamentally was poverty, however defined, and that increasing inequality was either going to create more poverty or make it more difficult to address poverty. Now, this is a very, you could certainly spend the evening talking about this. I would just want to emphasize that empirically the relationship between the standard measures of inequality and the standard measures of poverty, the relationship isn't that tight. That if you simply take countries at a point in time and you look at the USA, yes, it's got lots of poverty. You look at Sweden, no, it hasn't. So you learn something from that. But if you look at countries like the countries that we've seen, Sweden, Germany, so on, you don't necessarily see poverty measured in relative terms going up particularly sharply as inequality goes up, or indeed going down when it goes down, for reasons that we could talk about. It depends on how exactly inequality is increasing. And the classic sort of conservative response to those who express concern about the top in particular, share growing, is why should I care if Bill Gates has another, whatever it is, I suppose, billion in his case. It's not having any impact on the rest of the distribution, and it's certainly not having any impact on those towards the bottom, so it's not relevant to poverty. I think we'll come to ways in which it might well be relevant, but statistically it's not a dumb point. Of course, if you measure poverty a different way, and if it isn't a purely relative measure, if it takes living standards into account, then what's fundamental, when you look at what's actually happened, what's fundamental is what's happening to average incomes and incomes in the middle, the median, rather than the distribution. If you measure poverty in absolute terms as it gets labelled, it tends to go down when the average goes up rapidly, and as we've seen in the crisis, it certainly tends to go up when the average goes down. And that's much more central than what's happening to the distribution. And roughly speaking, the same is true of deprivation. So big, a lot to talk about there, and don't have time to dwell on it, but happy to do so in the discussion. We've had a lot of discussion in recent years about the negative impacts that increasing income inequality and wealth inequality would be expected to have on a range of social outcomes. And this is the spirit level, Wilkinson and Pickett, very effectively focusing attention on the potential impact of increasing inequality in economic resources on a range of things that we care about. And again, see, this is what troubles me in a sense about this line of argument. It's sort of saying you mightn't worry about inequality in and of itself, but worry about it because of the things it produces. And here are the things it produces. So I'm not particularly singling out Wilkinson and Pickett because they have a more nuanced story, but what you tend to see is the assertion that as inequality goes up, you see more family breakdown, more crime, poorer health outcomes, breakdown in social trust, in social solidarity, in our willingness to worry about our neighbours, more status anxiety, and we're on our way to hell in a handcart. Now, when you compare countries at a point in time, it's reasonably easy to see patterns that would suggest that there's some truth in that. But when you look at countries over time, as we did in this Genie project I mentioned, when you look at countries over time and you see what happened as inequality increased, it's not easy to see strong links between inequality going up and these social outcomes getting worse. Just to give you a couple of examples, if you look at the pattern of family breakdown and divorce in the USA, or at crime rates, they don't align with income inequality. Divorce went up before income inequality started going up, and crime went up for a while and has been going down sharply while inequality has continued to rise. So there's a lot more going on in terms of these very complex social phenomena. Inequality may be one factor, and yes, maybe we just haven't seen a long enough period of inequality rising and being higher. But the evidence to support the stronger claims here is, I think, not yet there. What we might want to worry about is the extent to which increasing income inequality undermines the functioning of our democratic systems. And this again is something that we read a great deal about in the US now. Because of the sort of the gridlock, because of the extent to which the wealthy can influence the political system in the US very directly via campaign financing, it's very easy to see a rather direct link between more of the income and probably more of the wealth being at the top and the capacity of those at the top to get political outcomes that suit them, including in terms of, narrowly in terms of tax on incomes, tax on inheritance and so on, capital transfers, but also more broadly in terms of, let's say, regulation and so on. So the evidence here is, I think, a little bit stronger, certainly the evidence that we came out of this comparative project, where you do see, in countries where inequality was increasing, you do see an increasing social divide in terms of, let's say, voter turnout, in terms of trust and faith in political systems, and in terms of political and civic engagement. So I think there's possibly stronger evidence to date about these political impacts that we absolutely should worry about. But you'd have to say, in thinking about that, that the very distinctive nature of the American political system and its financing makes the links there very much more direct. I'm not saying for a moment that we mightn't see that not all voters are equal in terms of their their income and wealth and impact, but it's not as easy to have that impact in countries where the political system operates very differently. But nonetheless, I think this is certainly and the social impacts is something we should worry about, but we need to see the evidence. So again, we often hear that one of the reasons we should worry about income inequality is because what we really care about is a level playing field. What we really care about is that people should have equal opportunities, and that we won't be able to get that if income inequality is increasing. So again, the line of argument is income inequality is a means to an end. It's instrumental, if you like. We want to address increasing income inequality because it's something else that we really care about. And yes, you could probably get more people to sign up to the notion that equality of opportunity is a fundamental value than you could to worry about income inequality per se, at least in the way that the discourse and debate tends to be framed. It's interesting that you can assume that increasing income inequality must be associated with reduced equality of opportunity, because you can think of lots of reasons why it should be. Your economic power should influence your capacity to maintain for your children the position that you've achieved yourself, for example, in all sorts of ways. Funny thing is, you can't see it in the data. You can't see it in the data. So in the countries where this has been examined in most depth, and they happen to be the countries where the increase in income inequality has been longest lasting, the US and the UK, it's hotly debated. Guess what? Different studies show different results. But in both cases, we are far from having a consensus that the evidence so far shows increasing inequality in opportunity. Again, something to talk about as to why that might be. Now, currently, what's very striking is that over the last, since the crisis, maybe shortly after the crisis, much of, and again, this I think has been fundamental to the reception of Piketty's work. What we hear is that inequality, we should care about inequality because it undermines growth. So again, this is an instrumental reason. We need to worry about inequality because we won't get back to decent levels of economic growth unless we address inequality. Now, I've listed off there a whole range of channels through which this might be the case that people have talked about. Some narrowly focused on inequality's contribution potentially to the crisis coming on. The notion that people were more willing to borrow in the US, for example, because their real incomes weren't rising. So they gobbled up the available credit that was being thrown at them, and therefore that contributed to the bubble and the bust that was experienced there. And you can tell a similar story in the UK. I think our experience, though, would suggest we saw that credit bubble at a time when incomes were increasing very rapidly, which suggests to me that the availability of credit, rather than what was happening to real incomes, was the fundamental driver there. But that's for argument. So there are a whole range of channels that you can think of where an economy with higher inequality might find it more difficult to generate economic growth than one with lower inequality. And the most compelling arguments here, I think, are the most difficult to prove, because they're the ones down the end there. And they relate to the sort of literature that has been very prominent recently about development, about economic development, and the growth of the fact that some countries have seen have transformed in terms of their level of income over relatively short space of time, and others haven't. And that's in terms of elite capture, in effect. It's in terms of inequality may get to a point where the rich, whatever label we want to use, find it easier to protect what they have and do what in economic terms get characterized as rent-seeking activity. In other words, it's not productive for the economy as a whole. It's them really doing things that are unproductive but that benefit them, and that they are better placed to maintain this and continue doing this in a more unequal society. And and that institutions more generally won't function as well and in the general interest. And this may indeed underpin the slower growth that we see, for example, in the US. Although you can also argue that the US, that the rest of us are playing catch-up, and the US has reached a particular point in its growth trajectory. We've been able to grow more rapidly simply because we're catching up, and when we hit that frontier, we'll face the same experience, or at least larger countries like the UK or Germany or France will. We may be able to continue to ride the wave as a small open economy. So, simple point to make is that in focusing on all these instrumental reasons for worrying about income inequality, we've sort of forgotten to worry about income inequality, which I think we should. Because it's rather hard to capture the very wide range of things that inequality in the distribution of economic resources brings with it. And it's difficult to capture them changing. But I think we know what we mean when we compare much more unequal societies and much less unequal societies. What we see, and largely, I would suspect in this room prefer, in the more equal societies, is a very complex web of social interactions and social structures that it's really very difficult to capture in these sort of instrumental arguments. So what can we do? Well, I'm watching the clock, but I'm not going to bottle out and just say, well, we can deal with that in the discussion, which would be the easy thing. So I think there's a range of things that we can do, that we can think about doing. None of them without their problems, none of them easy. And in the discussion, as we were getting warmed up here, many of them perhaps politically infeasible. So I have the relatively easy task of simply trying to think about the menu of choices open to us without limiting myself to the things that I think might politically fly. And I think that's, but we have to worry about both, but I think it's an important function to simply think through the range of things that we could consider doing. So, one thing that we could clearly do is strengthen the redistributive capacity and impact of our societies. And I'm talking at a level of generality here now rather than specifically about Ireland, but it applies, I think, quite generally. So there are the whole variety of ways in which I've tried to list here in which we could have a more redistributive tax and social transfers system. And there's a wide variety of choices. TASC has done, very, very valuable work in trying to think this through and tease this through, and we get to decide this and debate this narrowly in budgets in terms of some elements to it, but more broadly, there are a wide variety of instruments available to us. And I think we better understand now, I think there's better analysis available as to what the distributional implications of these choices will be. And as I say, the sort of commentary that we see is very helpful and informative in that regard, as well as the sort of analysis that we see, not least from Tim Callan and the SRI. Lots of this requires hard things, not just to do politically, internally, if you like, or domestically, but hard things to do in terms of greater international cooperation and capacity building in terms of the ability of states generally to tax income and wealth. But again, you might have said 7 or 8 years ago that it'll never happen. But the OECD the OECD as a vehicle has made really quite significant progress in terms of tax havens and in terms of tax harmonization. That's one whole area that again you could talk about for a very long time. But I suppose the point to make is there's a wide range of levers and instruments there, but that's not the only thing. It's not all about direct redistribution. It's also about a number of other things that we could think about in terms of the way wages get set. I said earlier that earnings are by far the dominant source of income for households, particularly throughout the bulk of the income distribution. we can intervene to affect the way wages get set. Most obviously through minimum wage. We see debates now in lots of countries, US, UK, about what gets called the living wage, which is higher than the minimum wages they have there. These are direct levers. We can intervene at the other end. We can intervene on top pay in a variety of ways. There's been some rather ineffective attempts to limit pay in the financial sector. Major shareholders have in some cases tried to influence the way top executive pay gets set. There's much more focus and public attention on this now, at least. But there are also other more imaginative ways, perhaps, in which we could also try and do it. And some people have suggested, for example, that public procurement mechanisms could privilege firms that meet particular codes of conduct in terms of the ratio of the top pay to the average pay. And there's, I think, a generalized feeling that the Anglo-Saxon countries, if we want to label them that way, need to move away from the very tight linkage of CEO pay or top managers' pay to short-term movements in share prices. But more broadly, when you look across these countries, what's striking is how different their collective bargaining institutions and labour market practices are. And that if you look now in the UK, bargaining is in many cases almost at the firm or individual level. Whereas in countries like France or Belgium or Germany, there's a structure to pay where pay relativities are still taken to be operational. And so, for example, when Germany, as it is now doing, introduces a minimum wage, it's on the assumption that this will affect wages throughout the distribution. Whereas in the UK, the minimum wage has little impact up the distribution. So there are choices about these institutions. Social investment, the social investment strategy is where the EU has hung its hat. What does it mean? What it means essentially is investing in the supply side, investing in upskilling, education of the labour force throughout the educational journey, if you like, but also trying to facilitate workers to participate in the workforce in a variety of ways through family policy. Much of the talk here has been about investment in early education, and that's a very important element, but the social investment strategy is much broader. So these are all components to a strategy. I suppose what I'd emphasize is the social investment strategy is not on its own concentrating on the supply side and upskilling the workforce. There's no evidence to suggest from experience over this 30 years that that's enough. It's very important, but it's not enough. You're then into a wide range of other things that you could think about doing. You could change the distribution of wealth. As I was sitting in the airport, I heard somebody on the TV talking about baby bonds, about this notion that you can assign some saving to children either on birth or when they hit 18, and that they then can use that to sort of build their wealth. That's a very, very crude and obvious way, but there are ways in which you can think of, for example, promoting wider share ownership, a variety of things you could do which would result in the distribution of the assets that accrue income and therefore change the distribution of that income. So you operate both on earnings and on income from wealth through changing the distribution of wealth. And the tax system, of course, has a role there as well. You can worry about the distributional pattern that's implicit in wealth, in growth. In countries like the UK and the USA, you can in particular worry about the dominance of the financial sector and whether that's highly problematic and something you could do something about, as well as regional patterns. It's commonly assumed that technology is what gets called exogenous. In other words, it's going to come at us the way it's going to come at us because there's some smart inventor in a garage in Palo Alto, and there's nothing we can do about it. But it's been the long-standing understanding in approach in economics that sort of has been forgotten in recent years, that technology is endogenous. Technology responds to the signals that the economy sends it. It doesn't just happen. So maybe there are smart ways in which we can actually influence the technological change that is produced, and therefore the impact that has on the labour market and on jobs. A lot of talk in America about influencing family structures, trying to limit family breakdown, trying to promote partnering. Good luck with that. Obvious things you can do to reduce the influence of the wealthy on the political process and therefore on decisions that affect distributional outcomes, most obviously in terms of the way politics gets funded. Again, you could say, well, good luck with that too in the US, but that, and it would be dishonest of me not to include on the list what gets very hotly debated in some other countries, and that is, in the UK in particular, strikingly, I must say I hadn't fully realised at a distance how much this dominates the debate. The debate there is about limiting immigration. And the debate more broadly is about, if globalisation is the problem, let's roll back on globalisation. Let's have protection. Lots of people will vote for that. I think that's not the way one would want to go, but it would be incomplete not to include it on the list of things that are going to be debated. So to finish, I suppose the central theme of what I've been trying to say is that what we've seen over the last 30 years up to the crisis and through the crisis certainly underpins what I think is now the very widespread realization that growth doesn't just trickle down. And in fact, that first bullet point is a quote from the OECD Secretary General. So it's not me saying this. This is now, and the OECD would have been not very long ago absolutely core believer in and promoter of the notion that what we have to do is promote growth and jobs. So growth and jobs are not enough to trickle down through the distribution. And certainly the long-standing American belief that higher inequality goes with greater mobility and opportunity and equality of opportunity, that's been pretty firmly dispelled everywhere except in the US. I was warning of the dangers of focusing on all the negatives that might be associated with increasing income inequality in time that we might see, but that we haven't necessarily seen yet, or that the evidence suggests that the causal processes producing these sort of social outcomes are maybe more complex than simply focusing on income inequality as the key driver. And that, not least for that reason, but also just for its own sake, we shouldn't lose sight of the core normative concerns. And our core normative concerns, let me assume, with inequality in and of itself. And that needs to be re-injected into the debate. A range of levers, none easy, but we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that job creation and working on the supply side in terms of education and upskilling will be enough. Because it won't. Thank you.